Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about getting around burned counties. Now, we use the term burned counties because the majority of the courthouses affected were burned. Some of them due to accidental fires, some of them due to intentional fires set during wartime, a lot of different reasons. But there are counties that are affected by other things. Floods, bug infestations, mildew and mold, all sorts of different reasons why locations that contain genealogical records might suffer some kind of catastrophe or damage to their records. So today I'm going to talk specifically about courthouses. Now there's a lot of other places that hold records, but typically those other places are designed to hold records, archives, historical societies, and so they take some of the things into consideration that might prevent some of these issues. It's not always foolproof, but certainly it increases the chances that those records will be preserved. Courthouses are particularly vulnerable because they're a place where a lot of records are created, but they're not designed to be archival or to be a fail-safe for long-term storage of those records. And so we end up with a lot of record destruction at the courthouse level. So we're going to talk about what kinds of records are typically kept at a courthouse, what you can find at a courthouse. We're going to talk then about some methods and strategies for finding information out about your family that might have been contained in those records that were destroyed, and ways around some of those burned counties. So let's go ahead with that and dive in to our presentation. We're going to start by talking about the kinds of records that you can find at courthouses. Again, this is pretty U.S.-centric, but some of the research strategies and methodologies are going to apply even if you are not in the U.S. or if your research takes you outside of the U.S. So typically at a courthouse in the United States, you're going to find land deeds and property records. And very often those property records and land deeds are going to date back to the creation or the formation of that particular county. So whether that county was created in 1913 or whether that county was created in 1713 or earlier, those records typically are held at a county level. And those records, land and property records, typically are not ever held elsewhere. Those are local records, and so they're typically kept at a local level. Whereas some of these other records, oftentimes they are rolled up to a district or a state or a federal level even in some cases. So another kind of record that's typically created and kept at a courthouse are probates and wills. So wills, of course, are filed with the local court, but the probate file, which is then the complete settlement of that estate and can include all sorts of different kinds of documents, are also held at that local courthouse level. Probate records exist sometimes even when there is not a will. So whether the person died with a will or without a will, we call that testate or intestate, then there still sometimes is a complete probate file that includes things like inventory of their property, guardianship considerations for their children, executorship documentation. So a lot of different things included in that probate file. Some of you may not be aware that marriage, divorce, birth, and death records, prior to most of the states here in the U.S. requiring those to be rolled up to a state level, were kept at the local courthouse. Now, I know in some other countries, those records are held at a federal level, at a country level, but here in the U.S., typically, marriage, birth, and death records are held at a state level. Now, that hasn't always been the case. As a matter of fact, many states in the United States did not start aggregating those kinds of records at a state level until after 1900. And so what that means is that you have to go to the local courthouse to access those kinds of records. Typically, marriage and divorce records are going to be the oldest type of vital record we're going to find at a courthouse. The government has always had some kind of vested interest in the marriage process, and then of course the courthouse itself, that legal system has to get involved in the divorce process. So marriage and divorce records certainly will be found at a courthouse level, but birth and death records oftentimes were also recorded at a courthouse or at the local level. Now, tax records sometimes are held at a federal level, sometimes at a state level, and sometimes also at a local level. And so you'll find tax records there. Those records are genealogically significant for a lot of reasons, one of which is it helps put a person in a specific time and place. It also can give you clues about an individual's age. And so those are the kinds of records that are oftentimes used in creating indirect evidence cases prior to federal census records and other kinds of records that we typically use when we're doing research in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So as we move back in time, some of these other records become more critical. Military records are sometimes kept at a local courthouse as veterans returned from war or were discharged from service. Oftentimes they would file paperwork at the local courthouse, copies of their records at the local courthouse, just in case that information was needed there. And then, of course, the courthouses exist mostly for the whole purpose of civil and criminal court kinds of actions. And so you might find maybe your ancestor wasn't a criminal, or maybe they were, but more often you're going to find information about them serving as witnesses or jurors or plaintiffs in a particular court case or a defendant in a particular court case. So a lot of different genealogical value that is in those civil and criminal court records as well. So there are other things that can be found at courthouses, but these are the records that are most often found at courthouses. And I have traveled to many a courthouse looking through land and property records, looking through probate records, looking through old marriage ledgers and birth ledgers, looking at tax records. All of these records become really valuable when we're building cases or when we're collecting evidence to trace our family tree. So then, of course, we have this problem with records that have been lost. Again, we call them burned counties here, but that can be any record repository that's been destroyed, taking with it a large swath of records that are very valuable to research in a specific time and place. So here in the U.S., you can learn more about which counties have been affected by this burned record situation by going to the website raogk.com. That stands for Random Acts of Genealogical Kindness, raogk.com. There they have a section of research guides, and under their research guides, they have a section of court records. So if I come here to their website, raogk.com, I can click on research guides. You'll see there's a section on court records. From there, I can scroll down to the list of states here in the United States. I can click on any one of those, and then it will give me an entire page about that state, including information about when each of the individual counties were formed. That's really important when doing county research to know, was the county even formed at the time that your ancestors lived there, or was it part of another county, so that you know where to be looking for those records. So there's some information there. If you scroll down past that county formation table, you'll find information about extinct counties. Keep scrolling, and now you will see a whole section that's called Burned Courthouses. And so it talks about the damage that's been done in the specific counties and what it is that was, what year it was destroyed, and if there's some additional information about what destroyed it or what types of records were affected, that will be included as well. So just here looking at Georgia as our example, you can see there were quite a few in Georgia in particular, quite a few courthouses that were destroyed during the U.S. Civil War. So we've got a fire in 1861, a fire in 1864, a fire in 1865, 64, right? So you can see, if you just kind of skim through this list quickly, that all this information has been provided. You'll also see that there are other things that have created some of these disasters. A cyclone in 1893 destroyed the courthouse in Meriwether. If I scroll down here a little bit, a tornado in 1936 in Hall County. Habersham County, the courthouse was blown up in 1898, damaged by storm in Thomas County in 1849. So you see lots of different reasons other than just fire. But you'll notice, of course, that fire is the most predominant one. The other thing that I want to point out here is that sometimes courthouses have suffered multiple periods of damage. So you'll see several of these where Miller County, for example, there was a fire in 1873, also in 1974. So we tend to think sometimes of burned counties as something that happened back in the middle of the 1800s, but that's certainly not the case. There are record disasters that have occurred even as late, even as late as the late 1900s. And some courthouses have been affected multiple times. So again, on the Random Acts of Genealogical Kindness website, you're just going to go to Research Guides, click on Court Records, scroll down to the state list, select your specific state that you're interested in, scroll down to the section on burned counties or burned courthouses, and you'll see some kind of a listing of information of what's happened. Now, in some of these states, I'm now looking at the state of Arkansas, you'll notice that it'll list if there are specific records that were not destroyed. So Benton County Courthouse, I've got quite a lot of family from Benton County, Arkansas. It says no mention of record loss by Bloucher. However, Arkansas History Commission sources say an 1865 courthouse fire destroyed many early records. There was mention of a log courthouse built in 1837, a brick structure in 1840, another brick courthouse built in 1873, but no mention of a fire. And so there has been, sometimes there's conflicting information about what's been affected, what survives, what doesn't survive. And so sometimes you actually have to contact the county. And we're going to talk a little bit now about some of those strategies for getting around some of those burned county records. Let me just make a note before we move on to that in other countries, if you're doing research in Canada or Australia, England, Ireland, Germany, France, wherever the case may be, sometimes you can just do a search through whatever search engine you use for the name of the location and the archive. So for example, I could Google, and I would do this in quotation marks so that it was looking for the phrase Somerset Records Office, and that would give me information or take me to the website for the Somerset Records Office in England, which would give me details about what records survive and what records don't survive for that specific location. So learning how to use your search engine to access information about a particular courthouse or a particular record office, if you're looking for something outside of the United States, is going to be a really useful skill. There are some other useful skills to get around some of these burned counties. One is just going to be your attitude. It is possible to find records. It is possible to get around burned counties. I've seen way too many researchers just say, oh, well, the county where my family lived was burned, so I'm never going to be able to get past this. This will always be a brick wall in my family tree. And that's not the case. I have seen experienced researchers who, with a little bit of tenacity and elbow grease and some time, have created entire family trees for locations that previously had been considered burned over. So some of these strategies maybe will help you have some of that hope that it is possible and inspire you to have some of that tenacity that you need to get around it. And I do mention time. Sometimes it does take a lot of time and a lot of effort, but it's totally possible. And I just want to make sure that you know that. I would encourage you to create a research plan. Now, if this isn't something that you've ever done before, it's a useful exercise. Research plans very often contain just a few basic elements. The first element is a very specific statement of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And I say specific, I mean specific, right? It's not, oh, I'm just trying to take my family tree back further, or whatever the case may be. It could be something as specific as, who were the parents of John Smith, born in Fairfax County, Virginia in 1802. Okay, so it's a really specific statement of something that you are looking for. The next element of a research plan is to create a list of all of the different possible kinds of records that could help you answer that research question. And then, as part of that research planning process, you start researching or looking into where it is that you're going to find those records or what kinds of records are necessary. Now, keep in mind, as you're creating this research plan, that this is necessary in all aspects of family history research, but never is it more necessary than when you're trying to get around burned counties, and that is what we call cluster research. This concept of family and friends and associates and neighbors, you have to understand the entire community of people that interacted with your ancestor. So if I'm looking for this John Smith, born in Fairfax County in the early 1800s, and trying to figure out who his parents were, I need to know who his wife and children are. I need to know who his children married. I need to know who his wife's people are. I need to know what he did for a living. I need to know where he worked and who he worshiped with. All of that research into the life of my John Smith is going to give me the evidence that I need to start creating proof of who his parents were. So cluster research is really, really a necessary part of this. And then I'm going to hearken to Elizabeth Schoen Mills. I think she just posted on Facebook a day or two ago about this concept. But basically the idea is you should spend more time researching what to search than you spend searching. A lot of times, especially in this internet access world that we live in, it's really easy just to plug a name into a search engine, whether that search engine is Google or whether that search engine is Ancestry, and expect to have results pop up that we can then sift through. And that's really a less effective way to be doing research in general, but specifically when we're dealing with burned counties, that's going to be a little tricky, right? Because the records that we typically use, that we're typically looking for, don't exist. So you need to spend more time researching what to search than you do searching, and that's going to go back to that research plan. What records have you identified that are going to give you the answer that you're looking for? And then spend time researching whether those records even exist. Research the county. If the county was burned, try to figure out what records may have been affected by that. Not all records were. Maybe make friends with local historians and archivists. Contact, the person that currently is the county clerk. Contact the librarian at the local library. Contact the head of the local genealogical society or the local historical society, or both. Figure out who the experts are in research, in genealogical research specifically for that specific area. And sometimes that's going to require a different level of research. You're going to have to get really familiar with search engines and phone calls and emails, reaching out to people, posting on Facebook groups, trying to figure out who to contact. So that whole phase of this research plan that you're creating, keep in mind you still haven't looked at a single record. The whole idea is you're just trying to figure out what records exist, where those records exist, what records might help get you around your particular problem. Also, maybe what records have been recreated. When courthouses burn, many of those records are lost forever, never to ever be recreated or seen or heard from again. But some records are actually recreated, particularly property records, because property still has to be transferred by deed from person to person, and there still needs to be some kind of a record of who owns that particular land, even though the courthouse has burned and those records have been destroyed. And so oftentimes those records will be recreated by a county clerk or courthouse staff. They'll go around property to property and get information about who owns the property, who owned it previously, trying to document the provenance of that particular piece of land. And so some of those records have been recreated, even though the courthouse fire may have occurred in 1891 and you're trying to get information from the late 1700s. It's possible that it still exists or that it was recreated. But you're not going to know that because it's going to be different in every county unless you talk to people who are familiar with the records for that specific location. Now, some of these counties have excellent websites or excellent historical society, local historical societies have put up excellent research guides. But again, you're not going to know that unless you spend that time researching. So I'll just state it again, spend more time researching what to search than you spend searching. It's going to be a really useful strategy for you. And then another thought is look at neighboring towns and counties. So sometimes copies of local records were sent to different locations. So if a courthouse in one location was burned, maybe they had already started building another courthouse and they had transferred some of the records there. Or maybe this county used to be part of a different county, and so some of the records still are at the old courthouse, or some of the records were moved to the new courthouse before the tragedy occurred. Sometimes copies of records have, some states requested that copies of marriage records or copies of tax records or whatever the case may be were sent to the state archive. And so there will be copies of the records from that particular county that have been rolled up to a state level. Sometimes I've even seen that at a federal level. So be sure to check neighboring towns, neighboring counties, check state archives, check federal archives. The kinds of records that you're looking for that are typically held at a county level sometimes have been copied to other locations and other jurisdictions, and it's worth the effort. So that's the deal, right? It is possible to find those records. Make sure that you create a research plan. Make sure you're aware of everyone involved in the life of your focus person and do that cluster research. Spend more time researching what to search than you spend searching. Contact those local historians and archivists. Check neighboring towns and counties, also check state and federal archives. And once you've then done all of these things, once you've created this research plan, now you can start searching. Now you can start digging through those records that do exist. Keep in mind that it's very possible that you will not find direct evidence. And what I mean by direct evidence, if we go back to our research question, if I'm looking for who were the parents of John Smith, born in Fairfax County, Virginia in 1803, I may never find a single record that says John Smith's parents are William Smith and Ann Jones. That's direct evidence, some record that states the answer to my question. But as I become familiar with the records and the time and the place, as I do that cluster research, as I start to dig into some of those records that exist elsewhere, I may find enough indirect evidence that I can create a statement that says, here's the conclusion I've come to about who the parents of this person are, and here's why. Here are the records that I found that support my proof or my supposition that this is the truth. And so get familiar with those concepts of indirect evidence, because in burned counties I've found that's oftentimes the only evidence that you're going to be able to put together that a particular person existed. So that takes me just to my final piece of advice, which is a lot of times in this process you're going to have to look at evidence in a new way. Sometimes that means having somebody else take a look at the evidence you've collected as you've started finding clues about your ancestor in records in other places, in fragments of records left behind. Sometimes it means you're going to need to create timelines. Create a timeline and look for those gaps in that person's life. What's missing? Does that missing information tell you anything? Negative evidence is sometimes just as valuable as direct evidence or indirect evidence. What's not there that you expect to find. So timelines are really great for doing that. Maybe you organize your evidence by person or by family group. As you've created this cluster research, maybe you create, I watch a lot of crime shows, and so that concept of a murder board, in this case it becomes a family history board where I put up pieces of evidence or information and I try to make connections. What connections can you infer based on different pieces of evidence that lead you to this hypothesis that maybe these are the parents of this John Smith because these are the only Smiths that are living in that county that are the right age that could be his parents, and they have these other two sons that I've found evidence for, and both of those sons served as witnesses to the marriages of these two daughters of John Smith, right? You start to make the connections between the different family members. So look at your evidence in new ways. Oftentimes, and I fall prey to this too, we just start plugging stuff into a family tree program or a database, and that's not always the best way to look at the evidence that we've collected. Sometimes we need to type it out to actually try to make sense of the evidence by, opening up a Word document and just typing away and seeing what kind of a narrative comes out of the evidence that we've collected. It helps us, again, see it in a new way, see some of those holes, and then we go back to this step about the research plan, start looking for other kinds of records we might look for. We spend more time researching what to search. We contact maybe different local individuals or genealogists who are familiar with that area. We check neighboring towns and counties. We look for other people who were involved in their lives. It becomes this iterative process. And as I mentioned at the beginning here, it is possible to find those records, but just be aware that some of these sticky research problems, while fascinating and fun to solve, do take quite a bit of time sometimes. And so we need to be patient with ourselves. We need to be patient with the records. We need to be patient with the process. But I can assure you it is possible to get around those burned counties. Well, that's all I have prepared for you today. Hopefully this was a useful lesson in genealogy methodology, particularly as it pertains to records that have been destroyed for whatever reason in whatever time and place. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.